Speaking of the tough on crime stuff and police and systemic violence, this is an article by Alec Karakatsantis. I'm always showing his work at Equality Alec on Twitter. Go give him a follow. This is in his Substack, and this is a fantastic piece about, I mentioned earlier, the Biden's push to add 100,000 cops. So we're going to get into some of these details with Alec's piece here. Tough on crime, one of the most successful pieces of propaganda in modern history. Most of us don't even think twice about using the phrase tough on crime to describe policies that promote investments in police, prosecutors, and prisons. I hadn't thought about it much myself until recently, but this post is an urgent call for journalists to stop using the term to describe politicians or policies that increase human caging or other forms of state surveillance and violence. One of the most consistent features of media coverage and popular discourse for the past 5 decades has been referring to policies that promote investments in police, prosecutors, and prisons as tough on crime, either explicitly in right-wing media or by implication in mainstream media. Politicians or judges who advocate less human caging are seen as soft on crime. I have come to the view that this terminology has played and continues to play an enormous role in the normalization of this country's anti-science obsession with mass surveillance and human caging. As I explained recently, one of the most remarkable aspects of modern news media reporting is the constant explicit link it suggests between crime and carceral bureaucracies. This link is contrary to everything we know about the structural and environmental determinants of interpersonal harm, but on a more pervasive and subliminal level, the very words we use to describe the issue may be even more important. The wholesale equation in our discourse between increased punishment and being against crime is a foundational myth. Why does this matter? Much of the rest of our work fighting against terrible policies that have no support in evidence will fail because at a deep intuitive level, people connect crime prevention with increased police, prosecutors, and prisons. As an initial matter, let me give you a few examples. Although this framing really became popular through Richard Nixon's infamous campaign speeches about liberals being soft on crime, politicians have weaponized the tough on crime rhetoric throughout the contemporary era. Ronald Reagan explicitly weaponized the term to expand punishment for drugs after the death of basketball player Len Bias. Bill Clinton weaponized the term to promote his infamous 1994 crime bill that led to a prison boom and added 100,000 more police. Democratic political strategists deliberately weaponized the terms to change the entire nature of the party's political platform in the 1990s. We now properly recognize these political strategies as grotesque, but our everyday media discourse still preserves some of its worst vestiges. The association of toughness on crime with more punishment has become a ubiquitous feature of our media discourse. Here are a few recent representative examples from the New York Times that came up when I searched. First headline, they wanted to roll back tough on crime policies, then violent crime surged. As Adams toughens on crime, some fear a return to 90s era policing. With violent crime surging, Mayor Eric Adams is testing how much policing a changed New York City will tolerate. And here's how the editorial board of the right-wing New York Post described Biden's frightening plan to add another 100,000 cops at a time of rising fascism and an imminent expansion of the criminalization of reproductive health. The New York Post viewed Biden's plan as insufficiently tough because some of the funding was going to public health, which that paper apparently opposes. This is barely a press release with the headline 37 billion and 100,000 new police numbers meant to sound bold to those not paying attention, even as more than half the cash would go for stuff the left keeps pushing instead of actually getting tough on crime. Notice the false dichotomy they set up there, you guys. Again, it's like Alec always points out. These policies don't actually work against crime, but they set this false dichotomy of the left versus crime versus being tough on crime up. What they want you to think is that leftist policies create or maintain or condone crime. And there's no evidence or science or anything to back that up at all. But that's the dichotomy that the media presents all of this through. False dichotomy. Perhaps the easiest way to understand that this framing was always intended to be a political propaganda slogan is to see how the corollary soft on crime epithet is used by the right. Again, the New York Post editorial board, quote, Biden's plan wouldn't do anything to address soft on crime district attorneys like Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg. Or consider the title of a recent article in the right-wing Washington Examiner. Soft on crime policy emboldens criminals to commit more dangerous crimes. There are so many problems with this framing. First, having people think more police, prosecutors, and prisons is tough on crime is factually wrong. Here is what the most widely regarded literature review conducted by the Department of Justice of all the existing decades of scientific research concluded about human caging. Quote, compared with non-custodial sanctions, incarceration appears to have a null or mildly criminogenic effect on future criminal behavior. Translation, sentencing someone to jail or prison has no benefit on future crime and probably increases it. We know that with recidivism rates. We know that. More importantly, the scientific consensus is that addressing root causes of violence through housing, early childhood education, medical care, mental health arts, child-led exposure, abatement, etc. is how we reduce what police report as crime. Given the scientific consensus, suggesting that pro-punishment people are actually being tough on crime is like climate science denial. It subtly suggests to hundreds of millions of news consumers the opposite of what we know is true. There is no scientific dispute that reducing inequality and investing in things families and communities need is the most significant thing we can do to improve safety across the board. People advocating for those investments are actually the ones being tough on crime. It is thus one of the great public relations coups of the modern era that the constellation of police, prosecutors, prison guard unions, bail bond companies, private equity firms, surveillance corporations, for-profit prisons, and their obedient politicians have convinced the news media to call the policies that benefit them tough on crime. But it gets even worse, as I show at length with hundreds of examples in my prior scholarship. These powerful interests, who the media calls tough on crime, actually ignore most crimes committed by most people. They only choose to harshly enforce some crimes by some people, almost all of whom are poor. So it's also highly misleading for the news media to call them tough on crime, generally, when what the media is really referring to are punishment of certain behaviors of poor people, while the same tough on crime interests routinely ignore millions of crimes by police, astonishing rates of wage theft and tax evasion, rampant environmental crimes, littering crimes involving trillions of pieces of plastic, etc. Anyway, I'll stop there, but you guys understand the point. This is something that Alec is often talking about, writing about, driving home, that our rhetoric surrounding crime is completely misframed, disingenuous, and intended to deceive and manipulate you into believing this false dichotomy of left versus tough on crime, or left equals pro-crime. Nobody supports violent crime, you guys. Nobody does. The left is taking a scientific approach in terms of analyzing what causes that crime and what the proper solutions would be, and the right is regurgitating talking points that sound intuitive but are not actually accurate. And of course, the New York Times, the New York Post, etc., always all too happy to engage in that rhetoric. So this is why Joe Biden is now pushing to spend a bunch of money on police. This is why Joe Biden increased federal subsidies for police departments. Because he feels that it is an electorally smart thing to do because of how propagandized our country is. And I also just want to note, you guys, I mentioned earlier we were talking about the Brittney Griner story and marijuana policy and drug policy. Many states still enforce marijuana laws. So as the Biden administration and Biden himself and Harris herself are coming out condemning the Brittney Griner sentence, they're saying we should add 100,000 police to the country, including in jurisdictions that are prosecuting marijuana charges. What message does that send? You're contributing to the problem. And obviously, we went over the litany of hypocrisies there earlier, with Biden and Harris both having a career fighting for harsher penalties for drug possession. But the other one I wanted to bring up is abortion, you guys. In many states now, abortion is either severely limited or out and out illegal. Who do you think is enforcing that? So while the Democrats fearmonger about the abortion issue, and refuse to do anything about it, really, or, measly efforts at best. While they fearmonger about abortion to raise money and to campaign on, they are pumping cops out into jurisdictions that are going to use that power, those police forces, to arrest doctors and patients for abortions. And he just thinks police are the solution to fucking everything. Unbelievable. We'll keep up on that story, but obviously police are not the solution to the problem. We know what the solution to crime is. But I also wanted to address you guys, even this perception of some crime spike is completely disingenuous and deceitful. So all sorts of issues with the framing, with the policy decisions here. Police are not the solution to the problem. Police, in many cases, are the problem. So anyway, we'll keep up on updates as it pertains to the police stories and, whether or not that supposedly is supposed to happen this week. Democrats are going to try to force that through this week, so we'll have coverage for you on what happens there on the next show.